One vitamin D danger you absolutely must know today. We're going to talk about the number one vitamin D danger you must know. You can make a very strong case for vitamin D being the number one deficiency in the world. And not only that, but it's of critical importance. And we're only just learning just how important it is. In fact, some people have said that it's a biomarker of chronic disease and in frailty. In other words, looking at nothing else like you only get one thing on the blood work, and there's a very strong correlation between your vitamin D status and how well you're doing overall. So we're going to talk about a number of critical steps that we all have to have in place in order for us to utilize vitamin D properly. And typically, vitamin D is primarily associated with calcium, phosphorus, and bone. About depositing. Getting vitamin D gets calcium into the bone so it can harden and make proper bone. And this was found out in 1920 based on something called rickets. If you have a severe deficiency of vitamin D, as you're growing up, as your bones are growing and lengthening, you can't make hard bone and you get what's called osteomalacia, soft bones. And they found out that vitamin D was completely responsible for these soft bones. Vitamin D is critically important to regulate inflammation. So if vitamin D is low, inflammation goes up. It is also involved with neurogenesis. That means building new brain tissue, making new brain cells, new brain connections, as in repairing brain tissue after concussions, maybe, but also in terms of learning new things. You have to make new connections, and vitamin D is critical for that. So when we ask if you're getting enough vitamin D, some people kind of argue that yeah, you have enough vitamin D to make bone. And that may be true, but the question then is, do we have enough vitamin D for all these other critical functions? But as important as this stuff is, there's way more. So cell proliferation, for example, the production and the maturation of cells, the cell differentiation, the ability of a cell to become a bone cell or a heart cell or a liver cell or a brain cell, that's all about differentiation and about gene stability. The stability of your genetic makeup of your DNA. With poor cell differentiation and with genomic instability, with those three things in place as we could have with low vitamin D, that is called cancer. So, especially malignant, bad cancer that is uncontrolled, is associated with low vitamin D. Another thing that is becoming rampant is autoimmune disease. The most common one is for thyroid. And we test thyroid antibodies on all of our blood work, and we find it probably in 20–30% of people, there are thyroid antibodies. But not just thyroid, there is rheumatoid arthritis, there is lupus, there is ankylosing spondylitis, there is psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis, and the list goes on and on and on. Even type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease that can be influenced by vitamin D. And then we have all of the neurodegenerative diseases. The breakdown of nervous system tissue or insufficiency, such as in Parkinson's, or Alzheimer's dementia. We also have neuropsychiatric disorders like schizophrenia and depression that are also influenced by vitamin D. So I think you can begin to see just how important it is that there's virtually no body function where vitamin D is not involved. In other words, are people sick because they don't get enough vitamin D? Or is the vitamin D low because they're sick and can't process it or utilize it properly? And the answer is definitely both. So just how big of a problem is this worldwide? Well, officially you're called deficient if you are below 20 nanograms per deciliter on a blood test, and that's about 42–97% of the world's population, depending on different regions, depending on the country. So in some countries where they fortify and they supplement the food more, they can be as low as 40, but there's still 40% of the population in those places that are less than 20 nanograms, which is disastrously low. And in some areas, especially in the Middle East, you can find as much as 97% of people being deficient. And then someone said, well, that can't be right. That many people can't possibly be deficient. They're not really addressing the bigger picture. Either way, even 20 nanograms is way, way too low. Are we able to mineralize bone? So the question is, what's really optimal? If we really want the full benefit for hundreds and hundreds of these critical functions, how high do we really need to be? So we're going to talk you through a few steps where you can start understanding that a little bit better. So classically, the idea is that we are out in the sun and we get sunlight, and as our skin is exposed to the UV radiation, now we make vitamin D in the skin and all should be well. The darker your skin, the more you kind of repel that UV radiation. So, the darker your skin, the less you can convert and make vitamin D. So if you're mostly out in the sun, like toward the end of the day, then the sun isn't strong enough to really convert a lot either. Then as we age, the conversion goes down further. And then there's all these different conditions like insulin resistance, which 80% of the population has to some degree, where they eat too many carbohydrates and too much sugar and the insulin stops working properly. It's not enough, so we have to make more insulin and we become insulin resistant. That also interferes with vitamin D production. The only rich product really is cod liver oil and cod liver pate, if you eat those on a regular basis. And the other one would be irradiated mushrooms. That's a pretty strong source of mushrooms that have been exposed to UV light. There's a little bit in various animal products and animal fats like butter and cream and animal fats and eggs, but not really enough. So supplementation is really the only practical and reasonable way for most people to get their vitamin D on a daily basis. So, now, when we eat it as food or a supplement, of course, it gets into the stomach, and we have to break it down. And in order to break it down, we need digestive enzymes to break down our food, and because vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, we also need to eat it with fat. If you eat a very low-fat diet and you don't release enough bile, for example, you're not going to break down and make use of that vitamin D very well. In fact, they found that by eating a vitamin D supplement with the biggest meal of the day, you could increase absorption by 50% because it's absorbed as part of food, as part of fat. And if you have a bigger meal, then there's going to be more digestive enzymes and a more involved absorption process with that. Because virtually no vitamin D is floating around by itself. It's all carried to where it needs to go by this VDBP. So not only do you need to have enough vitamin D, you also need to have enough of this protein. And if you don't, for example, they have found an increased risk of malignant tumors, especially as it relates to melanoma, breast cancer, prostate cancer, and colorectal cancer. And there is a strong association with these cancers and a low VDBP. And then of course, if you don't have enough of the protein, it's still going to help to take more vitamin D, but so that you can saturate it better so that there's more available. And in fact, they found that in a group of people, just taking 1,100 international units per day, which still isn't a whole lot, they reduced the risk of this cancer by 60 to 77%, but the binding protein also isn't enough. And the next is, like I mentioned, to get it into the cell. And now we have something called a vitamin D receptor. So the binding protein is going to take this vitamin D from the bloodstream or from and take it to its target organ. And now we have these little receptors on the surface of the cell. And only if those VDR receptors are working, can we get the vitamin D in and express that biological function. And these vitamin D receptors are basically on every cell in the body, but they're more highly expressed where the vitamin D is the most important. And these would be places like your kidney cells, your immune cells, your bone cells, but also in special places in your nervous system, a lot of different places, but among others, the substantia nigra, which is associated with making dopamine and Parkinson's. So if you have low vitamin D, you can't really get the full activity out of your substantia nigra. Your dopamine goes down and you're at increased risk for Parkinson's. Hypothalamus is an area that regulates your hormones and your hunger and your thirst and temperature and so forth. So now when these areas don't work, now we have neuropsychiatric effects like schizophrenia, depression. We have neurocognitive like Parkinson's and various motor disorders and dementia. We even have a lot of different endocrine disorders and hormone imbalances. Even diabetes has a very strong link to vitamin D, and they link it specifically to this vitamin D receptor, both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So when vitamin D is low, now there is less insulin release. We produce less. So we can't manage blood glucose as well. But the main thing, of course, leading to diabetes, to type 2, is insulin resistance. When we have a lot of vitamin D, then insulin resistance goes down. When vitamin D is low, insulin resistance goes up. And when our immune system is down, if vitamin D is low, immune regulation goes down. Now we have less defenses against type 2. Type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease. And that brings us to cofactors. So we can go through all these different steps. We can get the vitamin D into the cell, but we still can't necessarily have vitamin D activity, at least not all of it, because most nutrients, most enzymes and cofactors, they work together with other things. The number 2 thing is exercise. Believe it or not, because exercise optimizes the function, it activates every cell in your body. It allows it to live up to its potential. If you will now, first and third place is adequate vitamin D intake. So whether you get it from the sun or whether you need to supplement, obviously you have to get enough vitamin D one way or the other. Number 4 is magnesium. Magnesium participates in hundreds of different chemical reactions and pathways in the body. And it is the most important cofactor for vitamin D to do its thing. Number 5 is omega-3 fatty acids. The EPA and the DHA, they are also essential for activating and transporting vitamin D. Number 6 is zinc. If you haven't noticed yet, zinc tends to show up in all sorts of places. Number 7 is boron, which is another essential mineral. And number 8 is vitamin K2. Now, some people need to add that as a supplement. Some people can manufacture it through the gut, and we do get some through food as well. A lot of times it is recommended that you get your vitamin D3 in combination with a vitamin K2. I haven't found that to be optimal for you. Most of the time. I find that a lot of people need to start with vitamin D3 and do that for maybe 3 to 6 months, and then maybe for some of them to start adding in vitamin K2. But how much vitamin D do you need to take? We've pretty much concluded that most people should supplement, but how much? So the basic recommendation is that you should get at least 600 IUs per day, international units, and if you're over the age of 60 or so, you should get 800 IUs. Now, if you're in a different part of the world, sometimes they measure this in micrograms. And then you divide the international units by 40 to come up with the micrograms, and some nutrition labels will have both. The standard guidelines also say that 2000 IUs is the max that you should ever get. Now, here's the problem that for a lot of people, that is not going to be enough. That 2,000 IUs might be okay for some people, and it's a lot of genetic factors. It's about sun exposure, etc. But 2,000 IUs is not going to be enough for most people. 5,000 is going to be okay for a lot of people, but we also have a lot of people in the clinic taking 5,000 IUs and they're still deficient on their blood work even after months of taking that. And we test vitamin D on everyone in the clinic. So here's the thing, because there's so many variables, so much individual variability, and so many factors to weigh in, you really don't know unless you measure. You've got to get a blood test and you've got to get the level. So next time you do blood work, you have to either order it or insist that they put it on there. And the way to get from one to the other is you multiply the nanograms by 2.5. So I'll give you both units here. Then in the orange zone, meaning you're insufficient, it's still too low, but it's not critical. That's 30 nanograms, which would be 75 nanomole. Now what most people who are involved with functional medicine, with nutrition, with holistic practices, that people that do a lot of blood work and specialize in that, they will set the lower limit at 50 nanograms, which would be 125 nanomoles. And the upper end of optimal is probably around 80 nanograms or 200 nanomoles. So that's the range that you're looking for. Optimal is between 50 and 80. And the reason that we want to be in this range, and for a lot of people, you probably want to be toward the higher end of that, is that while some people can probably get by with 30 like we just talked about, there's so much individual variability in terms of absorption, in terms of binding protein transport and vitamin D receptor and your availability of cofactors, that if you have one or more limitations along the way, then you have to compensate by having some more. So if you are hovering around the upper end, you're probably doing well. And that's why it's so important to measure this stuff. So 100 nanograms would be 250 nanomoles. And where it really gets to be a problem is over 150 nanograms or 375 nanomoles. This is vitamin D toxicity, and it's not real easy to get there, but you want to make sure you don't get even close. You probably have to take tens of thousands for quite a long time, but like we said, there's also some, and we've had people get to 100 without taking a whole lot. For some people that could be 2, 3, 4, 5,000, and other people need to take 10,000 and they still don't get there. So you need to measure it and you need to stay and monitor and then stay in a good range. So I hope you see that vitamin D works. Is too important to ignore. It's too important not to know where you are. It governs so many critical functions. So you need to measure, you need to know where you are. You can't just take 2,000 or 5,000 and assume. And you learn your baseline and you get stable. You don't need to take blood work nearly as often. And the same holds true for vitamin D, but you need to start understanding how your body functions. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.